History on Book TV is next. Due to videotape problems, we can't bring you James Decay's book, Monitor, as we had previously promoted. Instead, here's the book, A Better War by Louis Sorley. He's a military scholar who researched thousands of hours of tape-recorded military meetings that took place during the Vietnam War. This book looks at the Vietnam War from 1968 to 1975. Mr. Sorley spoke at the Army and Navy Club in Washington, D.C.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Cyrus Crone. I'm the associate publisher of Slate magazine, and I'm honored to be here tonight for this extraordinary event. Our editor, Michael Kinsley, who unfortunately could not be here tonight, sends his regards. We're especially honored to have Secretary James Schlesinger introduce our guest speaker tonight. Secretary Schlesinger needs little introduction to those of us who know him directly or indirectly as a courageous defense secretary during the closing years of the Vietnam War. He was named to that job when he was only 44, but already had earned a distinguished reputation as a professor, senior member of the RAND staff, director of the Bureau of Budget, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and director of Central Intelligence. Please welcome me in joining Dr. Schlesinger.
Thank you for that over-generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, to a professional historian, nothing is more exciting than getting access to a trove of documents or documentation. Documents or documentation that previously was unavailable and therefore previously unanalyzed. The tapes of the Saturday morning weekly conferences of MACV, the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam, were made available to our author, and he has had the pleasure of going through those tapes, which are reflected in this volume. Moreover, there is nothing harder than to dispel a prevailing or dominant mythology. But this volume is likely to do so. It will have, I predict, a major impact. It will alter what has been the accepted but erroneous view that the Vietnam War was inherently unwinnable, I quote. Arguably, it was unwise. Arguably, it was not worth the investment that we made, but it was not unwinnable. This volume demonstrates that by the time General Abrams left Vietnam, that the Viet Cong had been essentially destroyed and that the North Vietnamese military had been neutralized. In other words, by the time he left, we had won that war up to that point. That victory was squandered for a variety of political reasons, and today the tendency is to cling to the belief that the war was unwinnable because of the vested interests in making the war unwinnable. It is my pleasure to introduce the author, Bob Sorley, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army, retired, a third-generation West Pointer. His grandfather went to West Point and served for 40 years. His father went to West Point and served for 30 years. His uncle went to West Point and served for 30 years. He is the complete West Pointer. And he confides in me that growing up as an Army brat, there was nothing he wanted to do more than to go to West Point. Thereafter, he had 2 decades of service to the United States Army. He commanded an armored cavalry unit. He taught at West Point, a special pleasure. He taught at the Army War College. Subsequent to his retirement, he was a senior civilian at the Central Intelligence Agency. He had earned his doctorate at the Johns Hopkins University and is now turning and has been turning that doctorate to good use. He's the author of Thunderbolt, General Creighton Abrams and the Army of His Times. He is the author, more recently, of Honorable Warrior General Harold K. Johnson and the Ethics of Command. In that connection, I read the following sentence. I am pleased to report that the Army Historical Foundation today presented its 1998 Distinguished Book Award to Honorable Warrior. Congratulations to you, Bob. This is a book that I predict will have an impact, a major impact. There is a whole list of tributes to the author and to the book itself. I shall read only one. This is from H. Norman Schwarzkopf, General, U.S. Army, retired. I quote one paragraph. Bob's book is an extraordinary piece of work that is bound to become a valuable part of historical documentation about the war in Vietnam. It answers many of the questions that have been too long on the minds of all of us who fought in that war. It also is the first to set the record straight concerning the outcome of that conflict. I just wanted to thank you for publishing this significant piece of history on behalf of myself and all of those brave Americans who served our country well in Vietnam. That is quite a tribute, and I offer you the author of the volume, Bob Sawley. Bob Sawley. Lost you in the light.
I'm grateful to all of you for coming and giving me a chance to say something about this book, A Better War, the Unexamined Victories and Final Tragedy of America's Last Years in Vietnam. My thanks to Charles Crone and Slate Magazine for sponsoring this reception. Cyrus, as you heard, is now associate publisher of Slate. When that magazine began 3 years ago at the age of 25, he was named its editor. Cyrus was born while his father was serving in Vietnam and grew up as a traditional Army brat, so he's right at home in this company here tonight. And I have another reason to be grateful to him and that journal, because they were the first to challenge the bogus CNN Time magazine story alleging use of nerve gas in Vietnam, and the byline on that story was Cyrus's byline, so thanks again for that. And I want to say how grateful I am to Jim Schlesinger, one of the great public servants of our day, and a friend who can be relied upon. Thank you very much for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence here of two people from Harcourt Brace, my publisher, who have been very important to this book. My editor, Walt Bodie, and publicist, Dory Weintraub. They came a long way to be here today. Thank you both very much. And while I don't see him here tonight, there is one other person I want to mention. He's a man named Merle Pribenow, who's a distinguished public servant, served 5 years in our embassy in Saigon, and has over recent months translated a 1994 Vietnam history of the war that has not been published in English, and made that available to me, and it was an invaluable resource for my research. I'm most grateful to Merle Pribenow. I hope that we can get that translation published so everyone can have the advantage of knowing it. Let me now turn to the book, A Better War, and in the few minutes that we're going to take here, I intend to discuss the book by posing and then answering 4 questions about the book. First, as to the title, A Better War. Many people would maintain there's no such thing as a good war, so how can there be a better war? This title, A Better War, refers to the period that I'm discussing in this book, which is the period from Tet 1968 through the end of the war in April 1975. And I contrast that with the way the war was conducted in the earlier period, especially from July 1965, when we introduced major ground forces for the first time, through the Tet Offensive of 1968, which is where this book picks up. The going-in premise for the book is that these later years are essentially unknown. In the subtitle, I say the unexamined victories of these years. And the reason for that is, first of all, that all the better-known books that are about the war as a whole are focused primarily on the earlier years, those up to Tet 1968. This is true of Stanley Carnow's book, Vietnam: A History. It's true of George Herring's excellent academic treatment of the war, America's Longest War. It's especially true of Neil Sheehan's Bright Shining Light. These are all excellent books, useful books, but the fact is that they are all heavily focused on the earlier years of the war. William Colby once observed that due to the prevalence of such truncated treatments of the war, the Vietnam War is known to most people as though the historical record given to most Americans were similar to what it would have been if histories of World War I, World War II stopped before Stalingrad, before Operation Torch in North Africa, before Guadalcanal in the Pacific. In fact, to show you how predominantly the focus is on the earlier years, in Carnow's book, he has a cast of principal characters that runs to a very long list, includes such notables as Morton Halpern, Alexander Haig, and Archimedes Patty, but not General Creighton Abrams, who served in Vietnam for 5 years and commanded our forces there for 4. So I'm arguing that it is not so much that our understanding of the later years is wrong. It is that it is based on a presumption that what we know about the earlier years carries forward into the later years as well, that it is more or less of a seamless whole, with the exception, of course, that we were building up in the earlier years and withdrawing our forces in the later years. But I have found that much different things occurred in almost every realm in the later years, and that is the focus of my book. So that's the answer to the first question, why a better war? Question 2 is the heart of the book. How was it a better war? And my answer is in almost every respect. In the earlier years, the way in which the war was fought was an effort to kill as many of the enemy as was possible. General Westmoreland, in his memoirs, said that it was a war of attrition and that he had chosen that approach, and the measure of merit, therefore, was body count. And the premise was that if you could kill enough of the enemy, they would be disheartened and they would cease their aggression against the South, and that a favorable outcome would thus be achieved. During the years that General Westmoreland commanded, we did, in fact, kill an impressive number of the enemy, but that did not have the desired outcome. In that period of time, the tactical approach was search and destroy, in which large elements went through the deep jungle very often looking for the enemy, seeking to bring them to battle, large set-piece battles, if you will. That was a very difficult way to try to fight a war, and even though large casualties were inflicted, when the forces that had gone out to search and destroy moved on, the civilian populace was once again exposed to the enemy, who often sought to exact great retribution on them, especially if they'd helped the Allied forces. The measure of merit in this earlier period was body count. Now we come to the period after Tet 68. Soon after that, General Creighton Abrams assumes command of American forces. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker is the head of our embassy, and William Colby comes out to head the pacification program. I consider that one of the most remarkable triumvirates of like-minded public servants that the United States has ever had the good fortune to put into the field. They were of one mind on the war, and their outlook on the war was, this is one war of several parts, and if you focus on only one or another part, you cannot succeed in the whole. The one war included combat operations. Yes, those still had to be conducted. But in addition to that, the things that had been neglected in the earlier period, pacification in the hamlets and villages of South Vietnam, and especially rooting out the enemy infrastructure there, which for years through terrorist means had kept the population under communist domination. And in addition to that, improving South Vietnam's armed forces so that they could gradually take over responsibility for the security of their own country. So those were the three things that made it a better war, instead of just focus on combat operations. In this kind of war, instead of search and destroy, clear and hold was the tactical premise. And as the main forces cleared out the enemy from populated areas, especially regional and popular forces, the territorial forces, which were greatly expanded, upgraded in their weaponry and upgraded in their training, moved in to secure those areas so the enemy could not come back and could not exact retribution against the people. So that was an extremely important part of it. And now, the measure of merit is no longer body count, it is secured population. And that's how you tell if you're progressing in the way that you're supposed to be doing if you're going to win the war. One of Abrams' strongest convictions, and he said this on many occasions, it is important that the command move away from the overemphasized and often irrelevant body count preoccupation toward measures of progress more oriented to attainment of U.S. objectives. What we've been doing, said Abrams, tellingly contrasting the new approach with previous tactics, is sort of a treadmill. We have to find these same units, and they're always getting ready to hit Saigon or Tay Ninh, so we go after that, and we're whacking them with B-52s, TAC air, and artillery, and dumping in on them, and piling on, and that sort of thing. And the history of that is that we go ahead and mash it all up, but then he sends a lot more guys down and builds it back up, and we mash it all up again and just, cause a lot of casualties and so on. Now, the way to put a stop to it, the way to get off the treadmill, is to go after this other part, which always seems to survive. The other part was pacification in the villages and hamlets. This is the way to run the war, said Abrams, our war. Again, he said, the body count does not have much to do with the outcome of the war. Some of the things I do think important are that we preempt or defeat the enemy's major military operations and eliminate or render ineffective the major portions of his guerrillas and his infrastructure, the political, administrative, and paramilitary structure on which his whole movement depends. And that was another Abrams insight, that it wasn't the main forces that were supporting the infrastructure, it was the other way around. The main forces needed the infrastructure to preposition weaponry, to provide guides, to lead them through unfamiliar southern terrain, and when the infrastructure withered, the ability of the main forces to operate in the South was much diminished. As 1968 neared an end, Abrams had now been in command for 6 months formally and quite a bit longer than that de facto. He sent a cable to General Earl Wheeler, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to say that in pacification, we are making our major effort. So is the enemy. In my judgment, added Abrams, what is required now is all out with all we have. The military machine runs best at full throttle. That's about where we have it and where I intend to keep it. The tactics of the earlier day, which involved multi-battalion and sometimes multi-division sweeps through the deep jungle, were now replaced by much smaller units operating primarily as reconnaissance, patrols, ambushes, and when they found the enemy, then all the firepower that was available would be brought in. But he didn't go out with divisions looking for enemy battalions. He went out with companies and sometimes smaller than that, and it worked a great deal better. A team from the Department of the Army went out early in 1969 to look at how the war was being fought. If there was any doubt in anybody's mind that it was radically different. And by the way, General Fred Wyand, who was serving there at the time, said the tactics changed within 15 minutes of Abrams taking command. And this team went out and took a look at what was happening there, and they said, U.S. Army units are fragmenting with small unit operations, replacing searches by battalions and brigades, and we are now working with the Vietnamese to an unprecedented degree, targeting on the enemy among the population rather than forces hiding in the jungle. And Perelman said if he'd been told this at high-level briefings, this Colonel Perelman who wrote this assessment, he might have been skeptical, but he said, I put my faith in the off-the-cuff comments of C-ration consumers, and these men are unanimous in their opinion that a new situation exists and that our response is effective. The enemy also appeared to feel that that was the case because after 4 failed general offensives at Tet 68, May of 68, September of 68, and Tet of 69, they finally, and I would say finally, decided that they were going to have to change their approach. They published COSVIN, which is Central Office for South Vietnam, Resolution 9 in July of 1969. And from that, when we captured a copy very soon after that, we learned that they were changing their approach to the war very dramatically. The resolution, said in analysis, directs the VC to preserve their strength in order to protract the war. It directs that large NVA units be broken down into smaller units and that they employ sapper tactics and target themselves against U.S. troops and installations. That latter an effort to cause us to expedite our withdrawal, of course. All provincial local force units are to be divided into small cells and target themselves against the pacification effort. Again, a rather delayed response that the enemy finally came to realize how much of an impact that was having. There's not time in these brief remarks to recount all the evidence that 15 years of research have produced, and in particular those tapes that Dr. Schlesinger referred to, over 2,000 hours of tape-recorded conversation at the Saturday morning strategy sessions and at sessions when the Secretary of Defense would come to visit Saigon, or the Secretary of the Army, or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the Commander-in-Chief Pacific from Hawaii. Absolutely authentic, contemporaneous material, not for show. They're sitting around trying to fight the war in the most effective way, and I am the first scholar that's been allowed access to that material. It took me a year to listen to the tapes. I was not allowed to take a tape recorder into the vault where they were kept or to re-record any of the material. As a consequence, I made almost 3,200 pages of single-spaced handwritten notes on these tapes. I had a sort of a scrunched-up hand for a couple months after that was over, but I'm glad to say it's gotten back to tennis condition again. But I feel very privileged to have been allowed access to this absolutely wonderful historical material, and I've used it to a great extent in the book. I'm emboldened by the results of that research and some 500 interviews that I've done over the course of 15 years, drawing on the material that I gained in the course of the 2 earlier biographies. I'm emboldened to say there came a point at which the war was won. The fighting wasn't over, but the war was won. And the reason I say the war was won is that the goal of a free and independent South Vietnam, allowed to choose its own destiny politically and economically, had been achieved so long as the United States adhered to the guarantees that it had given to the Vietnamese. Those guarantees were that, fast forward here just a moment, to January 1973 when the so-called Paris Accords were signed, theoretically ending the war. Those guarantees were that if the North Vietnamese violated the terms of the Paris Accords, the United States would reinstitute combat power in order to punish those violations. And here we're talking about air and naval power predominantly, or maybe exclusively. That if continued fighting erupted and South Vietnam lost major combat systems like tanks and artillery pieces, the United States would replace those on a one-for-one basis, as was provided for in the Paris Accords, and that the United States would continue to provide economic support for South Vietnam. By early January 1972, the legendary John Paul Vann, whom all of us know about, in particular from Neil Sheehan's book, said, "We are now at the lowest level of fighting the war has ever seen. Today," said Vann, "there is an air of prosperity throughout the rural areas of Vietnam, and it cannot be denied. Today, the roads are open and the bridges are up, and you run much greater risk traveling any road in Vietnam today from the scurrying, bustling, hustling Hondas and Lambrettas than you do from the VC." And he said, "This program of Vietnamization has gone kind of literally beyond my wildest dreams of success." That leads me to question 3. Why haven't we known this part of the story before now? Why has it taken a quarter century after the war is over for this reality of the later years of Vietnam to be known? One of the reasons, and I'll be brief here, is, as I've suggested, the better-known books about the war have concentrated on the earlier years. So that's a reason that we don't know as much about the later years. I think, too, imperfect reporting, I will call it that, during the period of the war itself has contributed to this. And here's why I say that. Most of the reporting in the later part of the years focused still on combat operations. And I think we can understand that. Most reporters probably think, as most people probably think, fighting's what wars are all about. And so we cover the fighting, we're covering the war. But in reality, as I hope I've demonstrated in the view of Abrams and others in these later years, the fighting was by no means the most important part of the war. The most important part of the war was pacification, rooting out the infrastructure, and improving South Vietnam's armed forces. Less visible things, harder to understand, probably harder to portray. So I think an imperfect record there is part of that as well. And then I think you have to say there's been a certain amount of distortion of the reality of what was achieved in Vietnam by those who are opposed to American involvement in that conflict. They have, I think, viewed it as in their interest, as indeed I would agree it has been, to portray everything about Vietnam in as negative terms as possible. And by and large, they have dominated the dialogue even for these many years after the war. So I think that's a contributory factor as well. And then finally, the new and authoritative materials that I have just described have only just now become available, and they are an important source of new insights into the later years of the war. And now I will get to question 4, the saddest and hardest question. Question 4 is, why was the war no longer won? And the answer is fairly short. The United States had made the assurances to the South Vietnamese that I described. Punish the North Vietnamese if they violated the Paris Accords. Provide one-for-one replacement of major combat systems that were lost in combat, as the Accords provided, and continue economic support for South Vietnam. And when it came to the crunch, we defaulted on all 3 of those commitments. Meanwhile, North Vietnam's patrons, China and the Soviet Union, were supporting their surrogate with increased vigor rather than drawing down their support. They were building it up. In this 1994 history of the People's Army of Vietnam that I referred to earlier, they brag about the fact that from January until September of 1973, in other words, right after the Paris Accords were signed, they brought in 4 times as much military wherewithal as in all of 1972. And that was only the beginning. From the beginning of 1974 until the end of the war in April 1975, say the North Vietnamese, they brought in 1.6 times as much military wherewithal as during the entire previous 13 years. So while we're drying up our support for our surrogates, North Vietnam is enjoying greatly increased support from its patrons, and I suggest that the outcome then was inevitable and foreordained. I don't think Americans would like hearing it said that 2 totalitarian states, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, had proved more faithful and more reliable as allies than the American democracy, but that was indeed the fact. I want to say just a word about the veterans of this conflict, too, in closing. There's a remarkable new book by a man named B.G. Burkitt called Stolen Valor, which I think would be of interest to many of you, in which he says that the true story of the Vietnam veteran has also not been known, and he has spent a great deal of time researching that story. We know some very interesting things that are contrary to what most people believe. For example, during the period August 1964 through March 1973, the period of the Vietnam War, if you will, volunteers for service outnumbered those who were drafted almost 4 to 1. 8,720,000 enlisted, 2,215,000 drafted. And I don't think many people know that. Then we find some interesting things from polling data taken in the decade after the war was over. The dust has settled a little bit, to the extent that dust is ever going to settle. And we learned that Harris pollsters were told that 91% of those who had served during this period said they were glad they had served. 74% said they enjoyed their time in the service. And 2 out of 3, this last is quite remarkable, 2 out of 3, 2/3, said they would serve again even knowing the outcome of the war. So I am hopeful that in years to come, the Vietnam veterans will finally get some recognition and some credit that they have so far largely been denied. Now, I want to tell you, since I have said the things I have said, and including the assertion that there came a time when the war was won, I'm not so optimistic as to think that people who have held one view of the war for, let's say, 3 decades or a quarter century are suddenly going to give it up just because Sorley says so. But I do hope that a younger generation of citizens and scholars who have not perhaps staked out such a fixed position on the war will consider the evidence and perhaps reach a different conclusion. And my belief is that this is a book of evidence, a book of fact, not a book of opinion. And so I think it might have that, I hope it would have that effect. I go back at the end to the beginning, to the title, A Better War, the Unexamined Victories and Final Tragedy of America's Last Years in Vietnam. The words "a better war" come from a quotation from Robert Chaplin, who for a long time covered the war in Vietnam for the New Yorker, and who said about a year after Abrams had taken command, "You know, it's too bad. Abrams is very good. He deserves a better war." After the war was over, after the boat people, after the death of Abrams and the death of Ellsworth Bunker as well, someone talked to Creighton Abrams' eldest son, also Creighton, who was then a major serving at Fort Leavenworth, and reminded him of what Robert Chaplin had said, that his father deserved a better war. Without a moment's hesitation, young Creighton said he didn't see it that way. He thought the Vietnamese were worth it. So do I. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. I've kept you standing and waiting for quite some time. I would take a couple of questions if anybody has one, and otherwise we can do what every author loves to do, and that's sign some books. Question, sir?
Authoritative, authentic works on counterinsurgency produced in the United States and in foreign countries, which laid out all of the principles cold turkey. And my question, I guess, is why did we wait for any senior official in the United States national security arrangement to buy off on that? Why did we have to wait until finally we get to Creighton Abrams, who understood the problem?
It's a good question, but it's really a difficult one to answer because, as you correctly state, the evidence was there for anyone who wanted to look at it. We could have known much more, much sooner, and probably be guided to a wiser course of action. I know that Mr. McNamara said in his memoir that they were so busy they really didn't have time to think about or study the war, which is one of the most chilling statements that I have ever read. But as a matter of fact, Mr. McNamara's own systems analysis office was telling him in writing and in detail that the approach what General Westmoreland was taking in Vietnam was not succeeding and could not succeed because it was ignoring this infrastructure in the hamlets and villages that I referred to. And I talked to the people who made those analyses, and I confirmed with them that they had been provided to Secretary McNamara. So, you know, what happened then, only he can say, and I don't think he's offered a satisfactory explanation for that. It is true, I think, that in the latter period of the war and in the earlier period as well, the field commander was afforded an exceptional degree of latitude to decide how he was going to fight the war within South Vietnam. And that was true during the years General Westmoreland commanded, although year after year, more and more people lost faith in that as a viable approach, and they were people in the government as well as outside the government. Later, the approach I've described that was taken by Abrams and Bunker and Colby was, if anything, little known, even to their own government, because they were focused on different issues. And I think you have to have some sympathy for the government in the latter years, whatever you think about them on other terms, because they were trying to walk a tightrope between maintaining enough support, meaning predominantly monetary support in terms of appropriations, to continue to fight the war in some viable way without losing the support, of the people and having to precipitously withdraw the forces. So, yes, there was plenty that could be known. I think the insight of the men in the later period was self-derived, basically, not something that they learned from think tanks and others. I remember when Herman Kahn went out to Vietnam, for example, and he told General Abrams that if he just listened to him, he would make him a hero and he'd win the war for him. And Abrams basically threw him out of his office. One of the ideas that Herman Kahn had suggested was that we dig a moat around Saigon, and that was rejected in Vietnam. Other questions? Yes.
Pacification is a difficult mission, and I imagine as a difficult mission, it probably evolved upon the Army if we were ever to do it again, since they get all the difficult missions. Do you see any structure within the Army or the Department of Defense that has the flexibility today to undertake a mission this difficult?
That's a good question, but I think the answer has to be that probably the nature and the detail of a pacification mission will be unique to the country in which one is trying to carry it out. And my view is that we were too willing to take the thing away from the Vietnamese in the earlier years and basically push them aside and say, we'll take care of this for you. And it was only in the later years when Colby devised a very viable approach to pacification and then got the Vietnamese to buy it as their own that things started to move in that program. We had pacification program one after another over the years that sounded good and then fell with a big thump. Both Ambassador Bunker and Mr. Colby often said that President Chu was the #1 pacification officer in Vietnam. He would go around the country preaching the importance of it. He put his own prestige and shoulder behind it. And when they started bringing all the local officials from hamlets and villages to a place called Vung Tau to train them in how to be better hamlet and village officials, President Chu went and talked to every one of those classes, and he said to them, you've got to go back and be a little president in your own area. And then, of course, they could go back and have the incomparable cachet of being able to say to their villagers, well, as President Chu said to me at Vung Tau. And so, I think it has to be unique to the situation in the country involved. I think we can help, but we can only help. And so I think we need to be guided by the insights of those who are indigenous. Anyone else? Yes, Ward.
How critical was the decision, I guess a political decision in the U.S., not to expand the war beyond the South Vietnamese borders? How critical was that to the ultimate result?
I think you have to say that it was a great hindrance to us the many years that we were not allowed to go into the enemy sanctuaries, both in North Vietnam proper and in the adjoining countries of Laos and Cambodia, because they built major base camps there and put huge amounts of wherewithal there, and then they could withdraw there anytime they wanted to. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that the strategy of attrition didn't work, because the enemy could basically control the amount of attrition that he gave up. When he didn't want to fight anymore, he withdrew into the sanctuaries, and we couldn't follow him there. So that made that a non-viable strategy. You know, of course, that in the summer of 1970, we did make one foray into Cambodia, U.S. and Vietnamese forces together, And it was very successful in its own terms. A lot of military wherewithal was scarfed up, and that clearly hindered the enemy's ability to mount a major offensive for quite a time, maybe a year, until he could build those stockpiles back up again. But at the time we did it, it was limited by how deep it could go and by how long it was going to last, and the president announced both of those to the enemy right at the beginning. So even when we did it, it was done at the political level, maybe not half-heartedly, but something less than robustly. I think that those limitations, however right or wrong they may have been in political terms, were militarily quite disadvantageous. Yes, take one more question, please.
Do you have any new information about the retribution that North Vietnam wreaked on the South after their conquest, or was that beyond the scope of your book?
No, I do treat that briefly in the last chapter and in the epilogue to a degree. It's as sad as anybody might have thought it was going to be. You know, of course, that at the end of the war, an indelible picture of the last helicopter leaving the roof of the American embassy, we withdrew all the Americans, and 130,000 Vietnamese thought to be at risk, people and their families. And then hundreds of thousands of more, maybe 1 million in total, became so-called boat people, sought to flee their own country. Tens of thousands more were put into so-called re-education camps. Many never came out alive. Others were killed for their opposition. I don't think anybody knows what the real whole numbers are, but as a consequence of the viciousness of the so-called liberators after they had conquered South Vietnam, there is now what I call a new Vietnamese diaspora of maybe 2 million Vietnamese living abroad, about 1 million of them in the United States. Some of them are my friends, and I know some of them are friends of many of you that I see here in the room tonight. And I would like to say this, too. They have been a very positive contribution to our country, to its economy, and to its culture. And we are lucky to have them now as countrymen, but you still have to feel very sad for them that they were essentially driven from their own country because they refused to live under tyranny. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for coming. It's been a great pleasure, and I'd be glad to sign your books.
Louis Sorley is a third-generation graduate of West Point. He spent 20 years in the U.S. Army. He has also taught at West Point and the Army War College. Later, he was a senior civilian official of the Central Intelligence Agency. Mr. Sorley's book, A Better War, was published by Harcourt Brace, found on the internet at harcourt.com. History on Book TV is shown every Saturday here on